Hi there, welcome back. Welcome to the Bible Project. We're at part 26 of our working together through the book of Genesis, and we're in this short little collection of podcasts where we're looking at God's design for marriage, and this is the fifth of 5. I'd like to remind you that the transcript for all these podcasts is available within the audio version of the podcast on the Buzzsprout podcast website. So all I've said so far in defining some basic principles that underline what the Bible teaches Christian marriage is firstly that God is the creator of marriage, that he intended it to be between two people, and he also intended that it would be between a man and a woman. And then last time, the purpose of the marriage was to create a model for family. And now we'll pick up with the fifth point I want to make by reading chapter 2 verse 24, which says this: "This is why when a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, they become one flesh." So the final thing I want to say about marriage as taught in the Bible, and probably the most important thing, is that marriage is a union between believers. God intended for marriage to be a union under his blessing. Two are going to become one, and they're going to be united. The strong opinion of all the main Bible scholars is that the one flesh talked about here includes the physical union, in other words sex, but also the spiritual union. This means that before the Lord and before each other, we are to serve each other and to serve the Lord as one. Now you may almost miss the final obvious point that underpins everything I've said so far, but if you're going to be one, if that's God's plan for you, physically, emotionally, spiritually, then of course that means that believers ought to marry believers. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul tells us not to be unequally yoked. Although Paul in that passage is mainly talking about business relationships, I think it can be definitely applied to marriage, and it's a sound biblical principle. So although that verse has two meanings and two applications, I'd also like to give you another verse that clearly, unmistakably says that if you're a Christian, you should marry another believer. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 39, where it says, "A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives." And then it adds, "But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord." So the Bible is clearly saying that if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, then you should marry a believer. And the assumption in the first part of the verse is that it is a husband and wife who are believers, but if the husband dies, she's free to marry again, but he must be a believer for her to be free to marry him. So this verse says it by statement. God intended marriage to be a physical, emotional, and spiritual union. And how can it be anything approaching that, particularly spiritually, if the couple don't believe the same thing? If you're a Christian, as far as the spiritual criteria is concerned, there is only one restriction placed upon marriage. You are free to marry another adult of the opposite sex, regardless of their age, regardless of their race, regardless of their cultural or ethnic background, as long as they are a believer in the Lord. Free to marry anyone as long as they also belong to the Lord. Full stop. To leave the spiritual unity out of marriage makes marriage less than God intended it to be. To be united physically, mentally, emotionally, all of that's great, but to add in the unity of the Holy Spirit is simply to experience a God-designed ideal marriage and what it should be at its best. The true blessing of Christian marriage is not an elaborate or complicated thing. It is simply one partner thinking more about the happiness of the other than they do about themselves, living in that great Christian principle of agape love, a love which is not selfish, a love which is not proud, a love that wants to serve the other, a love that will always enable you or I to forgive, And that, my friends, is God's design for marriage. Alright, how are we doing so far? I'd like to sum up particularly these last few podcasts together because they belong in a group by reminding that God's plan for marriage is that for it to be between one man married to one woman, coming together to form a new family unit who are united to each other physically, emotionally and spiritually. And I want to finish by just making a couple of quick observations about what I've said these last few days. God's plan for marriage is of course that it is monogamous, one man and one woman exclusively for each other. God's plan for marriage is that the family unit should be the basic building block of society. Later, as God reveals his full plan for humanity, he will add government, and he will later even add the church. In the fullness of time, the basis of society will be revealed to us via this book of Genesis as being family, government and church. But the most basic, fundamental, foundational building block of society is the family. And when that building block begins to crumble, it will affect the ability of government to govern and the church to thrive. That's a sobering thought, isn't it? Which is why it's vitally important we understand what God's intentions are for us and the human race. If we maintain these principles as God intended them, it will form the foundation of solid, stable societies. And if we maintain them as best we can within our individual churches, it will form the basis of a solid church family. And as a nation, if we try our best to apply these principles, it will produce more stable governments and more stable Christian communities working and living within those countries. But if we don't do that, then what will we have? Well, we'll probably have something approaching the mess the world is in at the moment today. Okay everyone, that's it for this time. Now the place to go for all the links to this ministry and other ministries and podcasts that I do is the podcast notes section of this podcast on the Buzzsprout website. There you'll find links to the Facebook page, my YouTube channel, the sister podcast, the Living in Faith Everyday podcast, and also links even to my SoundCloud page where I create the background music and sound design for this podcast. And there's also, even if you're that way inclined, a place where you can support the podcast and the other ministries to the tune of £1 a month, which really helps with the funding and costs of doing this. But other than that, I really trust you've been blessed by our time together, and I hope to see you all here again very soon.